Welcome back. Today's guest, Jack Teetor, is a veteran entertainment marketing and distribution executive. Teetor, the creator of Blind Logic, the Ralph Teetor story, shares the tale of one man's dedicated leadership, courage, and steadfast vision that shaped the course of the automotive industry and our future. Yeah, I bet you don't know who Ralph Teetor is, but get ready because it's a crazy, incredible story. Jack joins us today to give us a sneak peek into this inspiring documentary. So welcome with me, Jack Teetor. Welcome to the Sparky Life. I'm your host, Lia Lamela. I am here to create the sparks in your life. And here we discuss the builders of our civilization. All things construction career oriented every Thursday. Before we begin, a quick word from our sponsor, Supply House. Before you make that first connection on your next electrical job, connect with supplyhouse.com. They have got a huge inventory with the top brands in stock and real customer service from real people. That's right, you call in and you speak to a human being. Pretty awesome. Highly recommend you check out supplyhouse.com today. Now let's start our show. I was introduced to Jack through Eric, who is absolutely amazing and host of Motorsport Network podcast. He basically touched my heart with how passionate he is in the automotive world. And when he introduced me to Jack, I had no idea about Ralph, about his story, about Blind Logic, but I feel so privileged that I had the opportunity to take a sneak peek. So let's just dive into what is Blind Logic?
Well, Lia, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. And I love what you do as an activist for skilled workers. But Blind Logic kind of summarizes my great uncle Ralph Teetor. And I use that as a title for the documentary that I made. And so the story that I put together of Ralph essentially is his life story, which is really the life of the Industrial Revolution and also the life of the American automobile age as we know it, from its inception in the beginning to where it is today, and the new technology and the self-driving cars and that sort of thing. So what I think is unique about this documentary is not only just the life of Ralph Teetor and what he was able to contribute to the automotive industry, but also more importantly is really the birth of the automobile from his perspective, and not so much what started in Germany with Benz and what may have started in Indianapolis, that was the automobile capital of the world, but how Ralph got into the automotive world from his perspective and the family business before the automobile came of age.
Yeah, so Ralph's story is pretty incredible, and he is, in my opinion, the epitome of American culture, and everything that makes me proud to be an American. And I was actually irritated that I didn't know Ralph existed. Like, why am I not introduced to Ralph in school? I feel like this is something that I really should have learned about in high school, because having figures like Ralph, especially in the skilled trades and construction industry, is imperative. It shows that you can have leaders who value their skilled workers, who treat them with respect, who treat them with honor, who care about the company and the people that make up the company.
Well, you're not alone about not knowing about Ralph Teetor. Most people really don't know about Ralph Teetor unless you were in the automotive world in the 30s, 40s, and 50s and 60s. So the generation of workers at that time, particularly in the engineering, those in engineering knew of Ralph Teetor. But essentially beyond that, no one knows about him. And he's not in history books. He's in automotive books from time to time, I think, that are more historically oriented. But he's not the only one that's unknown. There are other greats that are unknown. But his story is a little bit unique, I think, because he comes from a very small town, almost like a village, and he was blind at age 5. So that is something a little more unique about how Ralph Teetor was able to navigate through life when blindness in 1895 was treated a little differently in society than it is today, or any handicap for that matter at that time period. Medical technology, of course, was very different. So society's response and perception was remarkably different than it is today. So the challenges were very hard, I think, from trying to have an independent life as a blind man.
So without giving too much away, give a little background on Ralph. We talked about how he was blind at the age of 5, but why is that relevant here in particular?
Well, I think it's relevant, very important, because he became probably his blindness, I think forced him in so many other directions in terms of his senses, hearing, touch. His memory became extraordinary because of his blindness. And he approached it, and I believe it started with his parents, because his parents raised him to believe that he was not handicapped.
Yes, I love it.
And therefore, now other parents might treat it different. They might coddle him. They might just, oh my God, my son's blind. What do I do? But their feeling was, because he already had a passion for tools and engineering, I think they didn't want to deter from that passion that he had for mechanical things, mechanical tools, machinery, and they wanted to have him keep that course of his passion, because, don't forget, that was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So I think his parents were wise at that time, that maybe our family even realizes, that they were on the verge of this Industrial Revolution. And it was all about mechanics and machinery and tools and what you can do with your hands. And because he was raised as not believing he was handicapped, he didn't, well, what's the word? He didn't like to talk about his blindness. He didn't want people to talk about his blindness. He didn't want people to feel sorry about his blindness. Even in middle school and high school, he just didn't want that to be the attention. And so as he was developing his other senses and memory, and his passion for engineering continued, his uncles taught him how at the factory, and he got together and with my grandfather and said, I want to build a car, because around that time in 1902, the company was building these one-cylinder internal combustion engines that they were thinking might be good for the railroad inspection cars, which basically was bicycle technology. At any rate, Uncle Ralph built this engine with the help of my grandfather, and then this rudimentary motor car that was like a horseless carriage. And that made news throughout the Midwest and even New York. And the article in the New York magazine or newspaper, the New York Herald, they talked about this engineering feat for a 12-year-old. And they never mentioned that he was blind. In fact, I don't even know if the reporters knew that he was blind. They may have, but they didn't mention it. But just the fact that a 12-year-old can build this motor car and drive it down the street holding a cable above because he was blind. So they built this line along the road, and because he was blind, it would help guide him to drive the car straight. And it didn't have a steering wheel; it had a tiller.
Oh, wow!
Anyway, that was one extraordinary thing in his younger years, and then things happened that were extraordinary in high school and college and so on and so forth. But it was those formative years that made Ralph who he became as a leader and caring for the community and giving back to the community. Because again, this is a small town. It's not Detroit. It's a very small town. And he stayed in that small town, and the company built in that small town. And then they eventually built factories in other little small towns in that region of Indiana. And I think that the small town aspect is essential to this type of story, because you don't hear about these great stories coming in these little small towns that kind of become extraordinary. They're out there, and maybe some people will tell more stories about these extraordinary people in small towns, but it happens.
Jack, despite the fact that this is your family, like this is your bloodline, and you're clearly passionate about it, and the fact that you want to share it with others is absolutely beautiful. But what was a driving factor for you to create Blind Logic?
Well, I think it was probably our family reunion in 2013. So what is that, 11 years ago? And it was Uncle Ralph's only child was my Aunt Marjorie. Now, she had written an extraordinary book called One Man's Vision that was published in 1995. And it didn't get widespread distribution. Back then there wasn't an Amazon, there wasn't ways to get your book out there. But when I had read that in the 90s, I thought, this is just an extraordinary story. And one day, it should be a movie. But I had my career in that studios and distribution companies and film. So I really wasn't prepared to say, well, how am I going to make this a movie at this point? I was kind of right in the middle of my career, and it was going well. Anyway, 2013, the idea of a possible movie came up with my dad, who was still alive at that time, and Aunt Marjorie, she was alive at that time, and then us cousins. And we all kind of think, yeah, that'd be a great idea. And they kind of looked at me. Okay, I'm the guy that lives in L.A. and
You're the guy.
And my brother leaned over and said, well, there's no pressure there, Jack. And, so I agreed, but I didn't really know exactly how I was going to start the process. But when I got home, I thought, yes, this is maybe the time. And I started getting excited. This is maybe the time that I start at least outlining, researching, and eventually putting a script together and writing it. So over the next 8 years, off and on, I started writing, I started researching and thinking, how can I put this together in a film, not knowing if I have any archives of photos or videos or anything to put together. But I thought, well, it all starts in the script, and I'll at least put a script together and research this and maybe figure out who I can get to interview and take it from there. And then October of 2021, I felt I had a good script. By that time, my dad passed away. My Aunt Marjorie passed away. But they were able to read an early draft of the script. And that gave me more motivation because they were very excited about it. And that gave me the motivation to keep writing this and making it better and do research. And when they passed away, well, I know at that point I'm going to make this. It's just a question of when. So 2021, I just said, okay, enough talking about it. Get on the plane, go to Hagerstown, meet with my cousin in Indianapolis, and just do what I can. I had a film crew there. We put them on camera. I got location footage of Hagerstown. My cousin, Ralph, had all the archives spread out all over his basement, and photographs and even some recordings and old 16 millimeter films dating back to the 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s. So I felt like I had enough to work with. And after I did all my shooting and collecting archives, I came back to LA and started. And then 2.5 years later, then we finished it. It was quite a journey.
Yeah, it certainly sounds like quite a journey. But I mean, the film is absolutely spectacular. I mean, so well done. I was like leaning into it. And I think I told you this when we spoke earlier, that, you know, when you're watching a movie, you're enjoying it so much that you make comments like you want to share it with somebody, and you forget you're the only one in the room watching the film.
Well, thank you very much. That's really very kind. Believe me, but it's just a documentary film, but it did come together, I think, quite well in telling all aspects of the historical times. And there was a lot of research to get everything accurate with the time period and what was going on. Because a lot went on in the world at that time in the U.S. I mean, we had 1929, Black Tuesday, the Depression. There were other things that were very challenging times. And the growth of the automobile business changed dramatically when Henry Ford introduced mass production. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting about that, it was an astounding change for the Industrial Revolution in the car business. And it affected my family's business at that time because they weren't set up or prepared for assembly line production. And at that time, they were building handmade engines. And at that time, it was the Teetor Hartley Motor Company. And they realized we're not set up for line assembly. But what they were also manufacturing was piston rings. And they had very successful piston rings. And not many people realize how important piston rings are because no one thinks about them these days. But back in those days, they had to replace them every 8, 10, 12,000 miles. Piston rings had to be replaced. It's just the way the engines were built. So piston rings were very important. So they changed the name of the company and got rid of manufacturing these internal combustion engines. And all the handmade car companies in Indianapolis, and by that time there was I don't know how many, up to 100. There was a lot of car companies, and they were all handmade, and they started as horseless carriage, and they put motors on them. And because of the assembly line, Henry Ford revolutionized the car business, and then Detroit became the capital because they had the resources, they had the capital, they had iron ore coming down from way up north. And so that became the car capital. And then you had all the pioneers in the automobile business in Detroit. You know, you had Buick and you had Louis Chevrolet, and then you had the guys that formed GM, and then it just went crazy. And then so things were happening at that time period, and the whole life of the car business was extraordinarily exciting. I mean, I wish that I could go back in time and be a part of that, because I think it was really exciting. And pioneers were coming up and inventing things. Engines were getting better. Car designs were getting better. And it was just all very exciting. And Ralph was kind of in the middle of it. And he became a Detroit fixture quite a bit, because he was going there all the time on business, because every new engine coming out of Detroit needed a new piston ring design. So he was becoming known with the engineering departments up there. So it was kind of an exciting time. I can only imagine. It was a very exciting time.
Let's take a quick break to hear from our amazing sponsor, Supply House. I don't know about you, but I hate shopping. As a businesswoman, my time is very valuable, just like your time is very valuable. And how I choose to spend it is imperative. But if I need to shop for supplies, and sometimes I do, I just want to check in and check out. SupplyHouse.com is a total shortcut for parts shopping. You don't have to drive anywhere and try to fit it into your schedule. Just visit their website and order anytime. Super easy. They're like the Amazon for the construction community. They have thousands of electrical parts from all the leading brands. Wiring, low voltage, industrial, you name it, they got it. The deliveries are fast. I love it. And I know you will too. Plus, their customer service is outstanding. You talk to real people, like humans, no AI bot nonsense. Everyone there is friendly and knowledgeable. So if you want fast, efficient, quality parts, use supplyhouse.com. Order the parts the easy way and get them delivered right to your door at supplyhouse.com. Now, let's get back to the show. Well, you could feel the excitement in the film. Like every part of Ralph's journey, there is something spectacular that he teaches us throughout his life. Like the moment regarding him going to college. I don't want to give too much away, but how that happens, how he meets his wife, how that happens.
Yeah.
So you get like a little bit of romance, a little bit of adventure, and then something that I resonate with and felt very strongly with about was how he handled the interaction when the demand for union came into play and that whole experience. Can you talk a little bit about what it was like during that time, how Ralph decided to handle the situation, how he approached it? What he did was really phenomenal. And do you feel that his employees and how they responded to the situation was a good representation of his leadership?
Absolutely. I'd love to talk about that topic, because as the industry was growing rapidly, more so in Detroit, because of all the big three, they were putting out cars like crazy and new models, and the factories were just, and I grew up in Detroit, and the number of workers being hired, the unions came about quite rapidly, and rightfully so, I want to say, because Detroit, with hundreds of thousands of workers, I think the unions came about at probably the right time. There's one of the interesting things, and I'll get into the union, is you have to put it in perspective of the historical times versus unions today.
Right.
The unions today do extraordinary things for workers in a lot of industries. But in Ralph's time period, they had a local union already in place locally that was just Indiana based. And Ralph Teetor's company was at that time Perfect Circle. They had 4 factories manufacturing piston rings for every engine coming out of Detroit. It was they had the most probably the highest quality piston rings that you could ever get, and that was largely a part of the company engineers, and that's where the name came from. They wanted the Perfect Circle piston rings. Well, in any event, so with these factories emerging, they did have a local union, but then the UAW, the CIO, started coming down and nosing around, largely because they were so powerful in Detroit and maybe other big cities Toledo that had some car factories, but Detroit primarily because the unions became very, very powerful. And then they started recognizing some of the parts business that were supplying parts to the automotive manufacturers. And they noticed this little company in Indiana, these Perfect Circle piston rings. Hey, we see them in the news occasionally. They're advertising. We see them sponsoring race cars at the Indy 500. We got to find out more about these guys, and maybe we can go down there and negotiate. And that's what they did. They came down in the 40s, and I think 1948 was kind of significant in particular. They signed a contract. My Uncle Ralph was very open to negotiating. He always wanted to hear the other side of the story, and he was always fair. He was paying good wages to his employees at that time period in the Indiana region, but he's always willing to negotiate and hear the other story. Okay, so they negotiated, and they signed a contract. The details of which I don't really know, but they signed a contract, and then the union was happy and came back and went back, and everything's good, except for a couple of months later, they came back and forced a strike, and right after the contract was signed, and I think it was an 8-10 week strike, and at that time, something interesting about the unions, they didn't really offer strike pay. So if the workers are going to strike, they're not going to get paid. Now I think they have strike pay. They have big funds where they help their workers along when there's a strike. But back then, I don't think strike pay was even in their vocabulary.
No.
Well, it kind of bothered my uncle and the other board members, and he would negotiate and try, but the strike was really putting a burden on getting the product out that Detroit needed. And he calculated the loss of their wages for a strike, and he kind of informed his employees, look, you go ahead and strike, but these are the lost wages, and it's going to take you 2.5 years to make up the difference of the lost wages. And they kind of understood the math, and then they kind of agreed to what the original terms were, and the union went away and everything was fine. I also should go back to the war years just briefly, because there was a no strike pledge that Franklin put on the unions. But that didn't stop the unions. They were still putting influence, even though there was a no strike pledge, and so they were still putting pressure on Perfect Circle Company and so on and so forth. Well, anyway, after 1948, things were going pretty well until 1955, and they came back and they struck again, and they kind of renegotiated, signed another contract, and then I think it was July of 1955, it got really brutal, it got really ugly. And by that time, you have to understand in the mid-50s, the mafia in Detroit was pretty significant. There was maybe 2 or 3 big mafia families, and they had a lot of influence over the unions. And they were extorting businesses and doing some pretty awful things. The mafia was getting they were doing it in New York and Chicago as well. Yeah. It was just the times. The mafia was pretty powerful. Now they have different ways of doing their things. But anyway, somehow they got in the back pockets of the unions, and they had a lot of influence. And Walter Reuther was president of the UAW at that time. Anyway, they felt, let's go after Perfect Circle. I'm sure that we can force them now to join the union, because during the war years, the number of employees grew rapidly at Perfect Circle factories. The company changed all their efforts to the war efforts, and they were putting out a lot of product, and they had to hire a lot more employees, and a lot of the men went off to war, so they had to hire females. There was a big percentage of female workers. But anyway, so it was all these employees, and the unions felt, gee, they've got 6,000 employees. Imagine what that'll do to, if they all pay union dues, imagine it's very powerful. And they came after the company, but it wasn't for friendly negotiations. Again, Uncle Ralph and his cousins were willing to negotiate, but this time it was a little different. They were threatening. And they brought in 1,200 sympathizers from other cities, and they sent up Tent City outside of town. And they were going to force the factories to become unionized, whether or not they were not open for negotiations. It was now. They were turning over cars. They were attacking buses loaded with employees. They were beating up people. They were threatening to bomb the factories. It was really getting out of hand. And for all these little small towns, the police had no idea how to do it. So they called the state police. They sent in 150 people, but then it was so out of hand that they couldn't control it. The governor had no choice but to call in the National Guard and implement martial law. And that's what happened. They sent Sherman tanks in, and there was gunfight. And the interesting thing about Ralph's workers, they did want to go to work, and a lot of them did cross the picket lines at the risk of being beaten up. And the ones that were already in the factory when these strikes were taken, they didn't want to leave the factory. And many of them stayed there with the managers and were going to just stay in the factory and kind of ride it out. Well, things got under control when the National Guard came, and things started settling down. They got back to the table. Well, they agreed on the exact same terms that Ralph Teetor offered them before all that violence, and then they left. So it would. I must say, out of the 4 factories, they did get one that was unionized, and Ralph, he knew all along, if the unions can convince the workers, fair enough.
Right.
the workers were free to do what they wanted. If they wanted to join the union and they were convinced that that was the way to go and they could pay them part of their, a little percentage of their paycheck, from Uncle Ralph's position, that was fine. He can't force his employees. He is going to be a crusader for them and their independence and their rights to make their own decision.
Right.
And because he was a beloved leader and he gave back to the community, and many understood what the company had done during the Depression years. If anybody was out of work, Ralph Teetor's uncle, Charlie, made sure they had a job at the family company, whether they had a job or not. He would create one. But anyone who was out of work during the Depression, you've got a job here. And a lot of those employees remembered that kind of commitment. And Ralph, all that his Uncle Charlie did for the community, building libraries, building a post office, auditorium for schools, that was firmly rooted in Ralph's belief when he became president of the company, and he was giving back to the community. So many of those employees remembered that, and that's why they were loyal to Ralph, because of what he did for their livelihoods. He built their communities. He built a better life for them. The other people that were maybe not so, they were newer employees. They didn't know the company did this for these small towns. They weren't aware of what was going on decades before. So maybe perhaps they had a whole different attitude, like, well, we're just going to be with the union. They're going to provide better benefits and wages, etc. I don't know what their thinking was, but they had their reasons, and that was fine. That was fine. But that was a whole different time period. Anyway, the unions never came back after that. Now, they did go after Detroit again. They kept going after Detroit. But they kind of gave up down in the small towns. I would like to think that maybe they really understood after being in those small towns that it was a very different environment than a big city in Detroit. And maybe their feeling was, yeah, let's not bother them. They got a good company. They're taking care of their employees. Let's just leave them alone.
Yeah. Well, something that I really enjoyed and resonated with when I was watching the film was the interaction with the unions, because I'm somebody, I started my career in union. I'm currently non-union, and everybody likes to be the hero of their own story, right? And all I ever hear is positive things about union. But the truth is that there's pro and con to everything. And
Right.
This was the first time that it depicted, some of the negatives regarding union and how the purpose of the union, right, it was to protect the worker. Well, if you have a company with great leadership that already protects the worker, you don't need to necessarily unionize, right? So this was a really fabulous perspective of getting to see, how this company functioned, how Ralph treated his employees, how he gave back to his community, and the loyalty that was there.
Yeah, and again, Leah, this is a different time frame, and it is a very good example when the idea of unions come up, to use this example of small towns versus Detroit and maybe that time period. And I think they were on the front lines. And it was, I have talked to family friends that are still alive in their 90s, and they tell me what went on there firsthand. And I hear some of these stories, and they were really scared. They were really scared. it wasn't a pleasant, hey, come in, let's sit on the table and negotiate the way they do it today. It was a very scary time. People were scared for their lives. And some private homes were even attacked. And so everybody was on edge, and it put the factories in turmoil. And meanwhile, Detroit is saying, you got to send us product. We need piston rings. Well, guess what's going on down here? So it was pretty interesting. And, but I think I'm very proud of the fact that, Uncle Ralph was a very calm man. He didn't let the emotions run wild, and he kind of said, well, we have a situation here, and let's see how we can get through this for the safety of our employees, and what we need to do to get through this. And obviously the governor helped a lot at that time because things were getting out of hand. And once that was restored, they could go back to the table and get things kind of settled. A few years later, maybe 3 years later, 1958 or something, the unions were going after GM, Ford, and Chrysler again. And Uncle Ralph sent the letter to the presidents of the big three, warning that if this gets out of hand in your companies, the rise and cost of vehicles will be rising exponentially because rising labor costs. We're going to we could price ourselves out of the market and be hurt for market share. Well, when he said that and wrote that letter in that time, I thought to myself, he's a visionary because he sees what's going to happen in the future. And a few years after that, in the early 60s, mid 60s, all of a sudden you saw Japanese jumping in on this and sending cars that were cheaper, made cheaper. And all of a sudden you've got really great cars with Datsun at that time, before it was Nissan, and Toyota, and they're coming over and they've got these great cars, and they're priced well, and people started saying, wait a minute, these are great cars, they're priced well, and how do they do them so cheaply and so economically? So that was coming about. So it was kind of interesting that Ralph was warning what was sure to come in a few years.
Yeah, he was a really spectacular human being, for sure. When I first heard the title Blind Logic, I was a little lost. And then after seeing the film, I was like, wow, like mind blown. Like it just totally connects and comes together.
Perhaps you picked up from the movie, and I don't know if it was clear, but you probably picked up some clues. Ralph's thinking was not like other people's, ordinary people. Because he was blind, his thinking was very different than ours, because he was thinking in logical terms. And everything to him was more on a logical basis, because in engineering, you have to really kind of be logical in doing all this. And I'm not an engineer. I would never be able to be an engineer, because it takes a person in a certain brain to be able to be an engineer. To me, it just seems overwhelming. And if you're blind, oh Lord, that takes it to another whole dimension and level. But he was a very logical thinker, hence the title Blind Logic.
Yeah, it's so beautifully done. Now, Jack, when is Blind Logic going to be available for people to view?
Oh my gosh, I wish I knew that. But I can tell you this. Af- After we finished the film last March, the end of March, we were kind of on the road doing a number of screenings and at various colleges, engineering schools, and making the rounds. And then when that was kind of finishing up, I started talking to film distributors in terms of how are we going to get this out. And it took a while to go through and negotiate with various distributors. And I found one that's based in Australia for our international distribution, and they've just started their sales efforts. And then I found a very good one here based in Texas. I like very much. They happen to really love the film. And so they're starting their efforts too. So our hope is that it'll be on a streaming platform, a Netflix or an Apple Plus or Amazon,
Yeah.
and get it out that way. And then we'll do a home video run, and it'll be on DVD eventually. But all I can say is be patient, and you're on the list of our press releases. So. And I'll let you know by email when we have something. But all I can say is just in due time, it'll be out there. And the people who end up licensing it to put it on, they have to like it too. Not everyone's going to say, hey, this is a great film, let's get it on there. Some people will just say, yeah, another documentary. They're a dime a dozen, and there's many documentaries out there. So how do they go by selecting which ones they want on their network? I don't know, but we hope that it gets out there for the public. And I appreciate your kind thoughts. And as a result of this documentary, I'm not putting a plug in. It's just a fascinating thing. We're making a motion picture of the Ralph Teetor story. And I was approached. We have an extraordinary writer and director too, with many credits for both of these guys. And they read my aunt's book, and they were so taken by the story. And then they wanted to see the documentary. And now we're starting to we got some documents signed. We're now starting the creative process of our notes, putting notes together, digging deeply into the insight of each character and how we're going to put this together. The writer is going through notes. We're having creative meetings. And then, we hope to get the treatment and then the script moving forward in the next several months. And this is kind of exciting because it would make a great motion picture. And the documentary was kind of the first step. The motion picture might bring the story a little bit wider for people to kind of see. And we're going to try to make it as accurate as possible because I'm kind of a stickler for that. I was for the documentary, is it just to be as accurate as possible. But anyway, it's kind of a fun process.
That's very exciting. And I'm not surprised because one of the things that I enjoyed most about it was that it didn't come across as a typical documentary. That's not how I received it. It was like a storytelling. It felt like a movie. And that's one of the reasons why I was particularly taken with it. So I'm not surprised that they're making a motion picture. It is literally meant for motion picture. It's going to be phenomenal. I am super excited for you. And Matt will help us with links to your website so people can get a sneak peek of what's to come and what to expect.
I might say one more thing. Lia, do you recall Franz from the Tesla company that we interviewed?
Yes.
He was the he is the chief designer for Tesla, but he said something in one of his interview segments that we had that I was really excited about. He said, we are at the time in our place in history right now that was very much like the horse and buggy to the car because of the self-driving cars, because of the technology that's happening right now. He feels we're kind of at a this similar type of revolution in the car business. I mean, who knows what the car business can be like in the future?
Oh,
We
yeah.
have no idea. They might be flying around. We just don't know. I think we're on the verge of something, and I think it's going to be quite exciting. So
It is. It is. It is. And I think, when you have people in those positions make comments like that, similar to Ralph, visionaries, it's something to pay attention to.
yes, and his cruise control back that he had the idea in 1936. The cruise control was really the first step towards self-driving cars.
Yes.
And the Smithsonian thinks that the Automotive Hall of Fame believes that the cruise control was really the first step in the sort of technology that has self-driving cars. And I find that kind of interesting. I mean, if Ralph Teetor were alive today, he would see these Waymos driving around LA with no one behind the wheel. And they're like Ubers now. We see them in the neighborhood, and there's no one driving the car, and it's really kind of fascinating.
It is. It is.
So we are on the verge of something pretty exciting, I think.
I agree. Jack, thank you. Thank you so much for coming on the Sparky Life and sharing Blind Logic with us. I greatly appreciate you and everything
Thank
that
you
you're
so
doing.
much. Yeah, I appreciate it being here, and I appreciate everything that you are doing for your audience and what you do and shed light on such important subjects. But thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
The Sparky Life. Don't forget to subscribe.
Create the sparks in your life.